And good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to try and keep to time. As it says on the slide, I'm based at the Centre of Evidence-Based Healthcare at Nottingham University, and I'm actually presenting this work. Thank you. I don't normally need a microphone, but I'll use it. So I'm from the Centre of Evidence-Based Healthcare at Nottingham, and I'm actually presenting this work on behalf of a student, Mariam, who's a Tanzanian medic who came to study with us at Nottingham on our Masters in Public Health. And a result of that, part of that programme is to undertake a dissertation of which we give the students a range of options. And this particular student wished to conduct a systematic review. Bearing in mind there's only a set time frame that she had. A study is for the length of time she was in the UK was a year on the course. So it was part of her dissertation that she went through the process of conducting a systematic review using a number of the JBI tools. And I was involved because somebody needed to support her and be her supervisor. And because it's systematic reviews that I'm particularly interested in, we were linked together. So unfortunately, she gets married this week, so she wasn't able to be with us today, otherwise it would have been great for her to present. Any declarations? My only declaration is that obviously I'm presenting this on behalf of somebody else, although we work together, but this is the 4th time I've been to the Czech Republic, but this is the first time I've been here for work, so that's lovely. Okay. And hopefully I'll be able to get these. And this is going to be a bit of an interactive 8 minutes, or probably only 6 minutes left now, because I'm going to give you something to read during the process about what we found when we came to get to the end to publish our review. Oh, I've turned it off. Okay. So the actual dissertation, you'll see there's a difference in the title. This was the actual title of her dissertation, and you'll see later on as to why I've framed this as a different subject, a different title that's going to be out on the PDF of the conference proceedings. Okay, so for those of you that are perhaps not familiar with this area, Miriam was particularly, we were interested around birth control and the opportunity of women to be able to access birth control. And we're aware that in certain contexts, that actually accessing birth control is an issue. And certainly from me living within the UK and colleagues within Europe, we take it for granted that we've got access to birth control. And in fact, we take it for granted in the UK that predominantly that's free. And that certainly it wasn't the case. And so for us, that gave us that opportunity to think some of those perceptions and some of our preconceived notions around this is actually very different to what actually is the reality. So Miriam was looking at this from the perspectives of Africa, from East Africa. She was born and brought up and was trained within Tanzania. And so we were looking at that from the perspectives of what are some of those barriers and facilitators in terms of women being able to access birth control. So that's what the review was about, and I'll put up the PICO and other details shortly. But I think some of the notable things in here, I don't know if has it got a pointer? Do we have a pointer on here? Has it got a pointer? No. Anyway, well, it's highlighted there. So again, what you can see on there is the fact is that there is a steady rise in the accessing of women being able to access birth control, but still within Africa, that's still lagging behind. And that has implications, as we're aware, of unwanted pregnancies, certainly in the instances of maternal and child death is still highly prevalent within Africa. And so it is seen it's very important that we try and give women that opportunity to access birth control. And certainly within our East Africa, it also is a very troubling area where, again, it's still just not, the message is not getting through in terms of being able to access birth control. So this was the remit for our review. For those that are not familiar, this is where Tanzania is. And in terms of what it looks like, those of you that will recognise that's Czech Republic, the outline of the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic, Tanzania is 12 times larger than the Czech Republic and only 4 times larger than the UK. But in terms of the context, something like 53 million people live in the country. Okay, and again, very much, I'm sure those of you that worked in some of these contexts will be aware that actually their standard of living tends to be very low. And again, accessing education is not a standard within some of these countries. So I'm going to go to the side here rather than standing there. So you can see what our aim is on here. So in terms of what we were looking to do is see what the uptake is of contraception within East Africa, but also to identify what are those issues in terms of the barriers and the facilitators for that uptake, and then to go through some meta-aggregation. Again, bearing in mind that this student was conducting this as part of one of her modules. So again, she did a really, really excellent job of pulling this together in the time frame that was allocated. This was the PICO that we developed, and again, we were conscious of including men in here, and you'll see in terms of when we come to look at the findings as to why that might be. But again, we were aware that actually men are quite play a pivotal part in terms of the issues in terms of choosing and, if at all, looking at using birth control at all. We're also interested in just in East Africa because we were conscious of the time frames, but also we were aware that there was no other work in this region. Okay, so rather than putting a prism up, which none of you perhaps could see if it was a much bigger room, we've just got some text here. So in terms of the outline of the studies, so quite a number, we looked at 4 databases. We arranged a whole range of different studies. Once we've done the extractions, we were actually left with 10 studies that met the inclusion criteria that we were looking at. Okay, so I just want to give you an overview in terms of what was identified from the review. So again, some of the barriers, and again, some of these may be things that you are familiar with. You may have worked in some of these contexts, but certainly from myself, it was quite illuminated in terms of some of the issues and that were being reported, because this was a qualitative study. So we were interested in finding out about women's or men's voices, about their experiences of being able to access and birth control. So there was a lot of misconceptions and myths about the use of birth control, that it would actually make you sterile. It could give you erectile dysfunction. There was a whole range of things that were being reported as to why they weren't accessing birth control. Financial cost was a big issue. Very, very expensive to obtain birth control in these regions, which again, for me, from a European context, was alarming, because we just take that for granted that we can access that. And also the range. They had a whole range of options of birth control that was available, so it wasn't like it was just limited, it's just that it was very expensive. Okay. Probably not surprising, gender norms and power dynamics was very, very prevalent within the studies that we were talking about. So most of the time, a lot of the studies talked about it was the men that decided what birth control was used, but also it was the the husband's family that were making choices about the uses of contraception as well, which is something perhaps that we wouldn't get if we were doing that perhaps in a European or a Western context. And also the service barriers, where the locations were. For some women, it was very difficult to access the centres to be able to get information, let alone actually to get any contraception at all. And so that in itself was a barrier. So transport, how easy it was accessible, when those services were put on, those sorts of things. How are we doing for time? We okay? Okay. So again, one of the things that was talked about within the 10 studies that we looked at was around the importance of communicating between families, but also between couples about what they were wanting to derive from the use of birth control and how that would be used. Okay. Oh, I have a minute being signed up, so perhaps not quite as long as I thought. Okay. So what I'd like to do is, and again, I think these slides are going to be made available to you. What I'd like to do is, while I just finish off here, I'm going to hand around a newspaper cutting, which I'd like. If you could just hand those back for me. So what I wanted to do, our idea, would you mind handing those back, please? Thank you. Okay. So there was a number of recommendations as a result of doing this review. So this was a student dissertation. She put her thesis together. It was submitted. She got an outstanding result. In fact, it was the highest dissertation result on the programme at Nottingham. So she did a really... I'm saying she, but obviously we worked together, but I want to give Miriam the credit because it was her dissertation. She did a great job in terms of pulling together the findings and what was done from here. She submitted it in September, and a week later, she sent me an email attached with this, and this is the article that I'm sending round here. Bearing in mind that this student lives in Tanzania, she's a medic, her intention was to go back and work in Tanzania. This article and the other articles is the president denouncing the use of any birth control whatsoever. And in fact, you'll see from the article that I've sent round there, stating that really people that use birth control were very lazy. They should have big families. That's what we should be purporting. And the fact is that the West wants us to use contraception is a lie. We shouldn't be doing that. So Miriam contacted me and said, I'm really concerned about what we're going to do in terms of the work that we want to do, because we wanted to go further with this and to publish it. And I contacted Catherine and Joe from the centre and said, look, you know, have we had this before? Because surely we've got other students, international students and international colleagues that may be doing very sensitive work around this area, and where do we go from here? So again, these are the sorts of, sorry, it hasn't, so the sorts of comments that were coming up were alarming for Miriam in terms of going back and practising within her own country. So I want to pose the question to you, and this is the interactive bit, okay? Perhaps you want to share with us, or perhaps this is not something that you've thought about before, but what challenges does this present for us, either working with students or our international colleagues, where they may be conducting reviews, and then what do we do with those findings, and how may that reflect upon that individual? And I know that, again, it may not just be in sensitive subjects, but certainly something like this. So we have a little bit of a dilemma in terms of where Miriam feels happy to go further with this. Her dissertation is already available within our university archives, because that's we have that all uploaded. So I think that's probably the end of my timing anyway, but I'd like to end it with that question, and I'm happy for any questions.
Contentious issue, very interesting example on, of what might happen when we try to review the evidence. Any particular comments, really, I guess, as much as questions? Do you want to have
Yeah, okay.
We've got a spare one here.
I'm assistant now. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, it was more of a comment than anything else. I actually visited Zambia earlier this year as part of an Erasmus project, and the colleague I went with is a clinical psychologist who specialises in infertility, which is very interesting in Africa. And one of the things she was very interested is, one, that infertility is an unrecognised problem, causes huge problems in families, and one of the issues is that, of course, it's always the woman's fault. So the men are never investigated, and she had newspaper cuttings of women who'd actually, the one woman had had her arm chopped off and been attacked by her husband because she was infertile. And I think it just brings to mind the issues. So when you start thinking about these very cultural, very sensitive issues, it just brings into mind all sorts of different things. So we just thought that was interesting in relation to what you were saying.
Any other comments? So what is the role of evidence-based healthcare in this context?
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, it's about raising, isn't it? About this is the issue in terms of she's identified, or we've identified, that there are a number of barriers that are stopping women accessing birth control. One of them being around financial costs, where the services are located, but also all this about the cultural norms and who's making these decisions. And that's not something that necessarily a review of evidence is going to be able to change overnight. But certainly it's about raising that and being aware, and it's very contradictory to what the president is clearly saying. And in fact, I only did a Google search. Other search tools are available, but I did a Google search last week, and this is still very prolific, and this is still in the political arena, talking about this, and very few voices arguing against it that have got any clout to be able to do anything contrary to what is being clearly disseminated down. Yeah, so a worrying place.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So watch this space with that one. Right. Any final comments? No. Okay, thank you very much, Catherine.